Good afternoon
People keep
and welcome back. Many apologies, we're a little bit late, but I'm afraid that comes down to the speed of light and the distance to America. I'll leave you to think about that. But we're delighted to have Mark Anderson with us. And Mark's going to be delivering global cities from local globalism to smart servitude. Now, Mark has been a reporter on many topics for a great many years. He emails under Truth Hound, which I've always thought was a really excellent name. And he's done a lot of good work for UK Column, but also publishes in American Free Press. And we're always delighted to have his take on matters, particularly as he's spent a lot of time looking at the machinations of the organizations at higher level. I'm talking about the globalist organizations, whether it's the World Economic Forum or the Bilderberg organization, or what happens in Chicago, which seems to be a particular power base for setting a world agenda. Mark's been a real truth hound for digging out what's been going on and what's being planned for us. So, Mark, I'd like to welcome you to what's actually a pretty grey and wet Plymouth, but you've experienced that for yourself.
Yeah, we almost had a storm here, which would have been very disruptive. We have a metal roof. You get a storm off the Gulf of Mexico, it can be pretty wicked, but we avoided that. At any rate, it's great to be with you here. This is a very engaging topic. And if I may, I'll just go right into it.
I think that would be a really good idea because we can make up a little bit of time. So we'll put up the placeholder. You'll see a placeholder come on screen, and then you'll be able to take your talk away. So thank you very much.
Yeah, you should be seeing the What Are Global Cities screen. That's
well, just wait a second, Mark.
Sure. Okay, welcome everyone in Viewerland. Great to be here. And I'll get right into this. What are global cities? Generally speaking, a global city is a city that serves as a primary node in the global economic network. The concept is based on the thesis that globalization has created a hierarchy of strategic geographic locations with varying degrees of influence over finance, trade, and culture worldwide. That's according to Wikipedia, but that is accurate. Right now, New York and London, both sides of the pond here, are the only cities ranked Alpha++ by the Globalization and World Cities Research Network. Paris and Tokyo also rate highly, as do Hong Kong, Los Angeles, Toronto, Beijing, Singapore, and Chicago. But over the last decade or so, especially what I've determined, global cities has come to mean a league of like-minded cities collaborating to localize globalism. Yes, you heard me right, localize globalism, and create a world state from the inside out, not from the outside in, or you might say from the bottom up and not the top down. Participating cities shun their national identity. There's an allegiance problem here, and they form a worldwide cities network that will function like a world parliament and be sold as the inevitable wave of the future in tandem with the installment of the Internet of Things and other digital infrastructure to upgrade these cities into smart cities that can seamlessly track, if they need to, your whereabouts, activities, financial transactions, etc. And here's the real key part. All roads lead to the strategic, sustainable development goals of the UN. Conformity with those UN Sustainable Development Goals is paramount. So they all want to steer in that same common direction. That's very interesting. Keep that in mind. And we're moving on here. These are the main global cities outlets. There are others, but for the sake of today's discussion, these are the main ones. Global cities key outlets. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs figures very heavily. The Global Parliament of Mayors, just about the same. The Global Cities Initiative of the Brookings Institution and J.P. Morgan Chase, that's a curious combination if there ever was one. and everybody's favorite think tank, Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, your friends and mine. But global cities, key outlets, here's the thing. There's an underlying worldview that absolutely has to be adopted by these cities. The underlying worldview is one of hyper, and I mean hyper internationalism and extreme liberalism slash wokeism or wokeness on social issues. Any, and I mean any, genuinely conservative, nationalist, populist, constitutionalist, Christian, pro tariff, America First views, by definition, are not just illiberal and they're not just disallowed. They're considered a heresy, a species of extremism bordering on criminality. And that is no joke. They don't want any dissent when it comes to these things. Otherwise, another thing they call you, of course, is an autocrat or you're autocratic. Well, that's really kind of a neutral term. An autocrat can be a bad or a good thing. It kind of depends on the context. But anyway, moving on, keeping these things in mind, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, at least on our side of the pond, this figures very heavily. The CCGA for short, in our time, is the main promoter of the global cities concept, especially in the US, and is one of the most active of all US and world think tanks. And keep in mind that under the World Affairs Council of America, or WACA, in the US alone, there are 90 some think tanks, 90 think tanks along these lines. Houston, Dallas, San Francisco, New York, San Antonio. So there's these mini CFRs just honeycombing the U.S. The Chicago Council is not technically a member that is of WACA, but they're right in league with them. Anyway, founded in 1922, this former Chicago Council on Foreign Relations is a close ideological cousin to the infamous New York CFR, which was founded a year earlier. The Chicago Council's president, emphasis here, Ivo Daalder, pictured to the right, he's a former U.S. envoy to NATO. He rolled out the Council's Forum on Global Cities back in 2015. I started covering him 1 year later. By 2020, it was renamed the Pritzker Forum on Global Cities due to massive financing from the Pritzker family, which owns the Hyatt hotel chain, among other things. J.B. Pritzker is the current governor of Illinois, and he attended what appeared to be his first World Economic Forum this year. The Pritzker Global Cities Forum, as of 2021, went virtual for a time, they said due to COVID, and is now presented in a more piecemeal fashion instead of being one big yearly forum. So that's a little more background. Moving on, here it is, 2015 in May, the first ever Chicago Forum on Global Cities commences in Chicago. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs and the Financial Times today launched, that is, inaugurated, the Chicago Forum on Global Cities. This 3-day forum on the future of global cities is bringing civic, business, cultural, and academic leaders from London, Beijing, Paris, Dubai, Singapore, and beyond to Chicago in late May of that year for a series of discussions about what drives global cities and how they, in turn, drive the world. Now, that sounds rather bold, but at the beginning there in 2015, things were kind of modest. It didn't sound too threatening or too menacing or too subversive, if that's the right word. It's sort of walk before you run in global city circles. But as we see, as we move on, things begin changing in terms of the context. This is still 2015, a little bit more. This first ever Chicago Forum, look at some of the topics defining the global city, which I did to a point. Global cities driving the global economy. Smart cities, there we go, data, innovation, and social apps. Other ones, some of the ones I underlined are important, and some of the other ones are too. Designing environmentally sustainable cities, because they all have to meet those sustainable development goals. The foreign policy of cities, I outlined in the bottom of that. And there's others, safer cities, security and vulnerability, that also has to do with smart cities, art and culture, reimagining urban infrastructure. University of Chicago Urban Labs, University of Chicago is major Rockefeller money. It always was from the very beginning. Scarcity of resources. They always assume there's scarcities, whether there are or not. A growing demand for food, water, and energy. And this is an important time, a good time to make an important point. not all smart cities will be global cities by definition, but you can bet that all global cities will be smart cities. They'll have that technological infrastructure. Why? Because these globalists figure and they wish and they figure and they predict that most everyone, probably maybe 2/3 of the population by 2050, will want to live in cities. They make that assumption. So, with most of the people living in cities in the world, according to their projections, they therefore would want and it would necessitate the smart cities infrastructure, all the surveillance for crime, for financial transactions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, a lot of it is looking at crime in terms of predictive measures, trying to predict when crime would happen. That can be rather tyrannical, depending on how that dishes out. But it's important to keep that in mind. Not all uh, smart cities will be global, but all the global ones will be smart cities by necessity, with all the people living there and what that will mean with those numbers of people, the mass transit changes they'll make, that'll fit into smart cities as well. They're looking at buildings that would be self-generating in terms of energy. There's miscellaneous individual things that might have merit. The problem, of course, is the context. Your 15-minute cities is one contextual problem. Yes, it's nice to have everything close to each other and you can get to work and back home and to the nightclubs and restaurants and the bank and whatever you want to do in a small vicinity. That might seem convenient, but as we've heard, they want to keep people sequestered into certain city districts, it appears, and you wouldn't be able to leave your district necessarily without permission, depending on how many carbon credits you've used, depending on how much financial credit you have or you've used. These are all the things that play into this concept. But moving on, now we have 2016. This is when I started covering it. Chicago Forum on Global Cities opens in Chicago. It was mainly at the Art Institute in the auditorium there, and I covered that. A former agricultural secretary under Clinton, Dan Glickman, got up at the podium, among others, and predicted, like I said, that 2/3 of the world's peoples would be living in or near cities, the big cities, by about 2040, 2050. Very interesting. I don't know how accurate that is, but this is a recurring theme. Here it just says mayors, artists, educators, CEOs converge today for the Forum on Global Cities, a cross-sector dialogue about the rising power of global cities. Things are heating up a little bit here, and the challenges and opportunities they face. The three-day forum is co-hosted by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, CCGA, and the Financial Times. There they are again, and it'll be streamed, etc. A quick note on the Financial Times and the media. The Financial Times, as soon as 2016 rolled around, and I think they were even involved in 2015, became not a reporter of the Forum on Global Cities, but a participant with the Forum on Global Cities. And this is a lot like the Trilateral Commission or the think tanks in Washington, D.C., and the Bilderberg Group, even, especially. You have media that collaborate and take part in these things, and they rarely, if ever, objectively report on these things. And the Financial Times is a major wheel here, being a partner with the Chicago Council. So it really is a malpractice of journalism to collaborate with these organizations which have an agenda rather than reporting on them honestly and objectively like UK Column does. And so we're moving on. And this is the 2016 forum, just a little bit more about it. Transforming food systems in urban zones, the inclusive city, there's that wokeness creeping in. The plenary that time, June 3rd, 2016, disruptive technologies and the sharing economy. Again, more hints that global cities will be smart cities. And that was quite the forum to attend. I even managed to have lunch with a lot of those globalists. They allowed the media to do that. It was almost like having lunch with Bilderberg. And in fact, these groups are much more active than glacial organizations like Bilderberg. This is really where the rubber meets the road. Brookings Institution, the Chicago Council, and so on. This is where the real action takes place. But we're moving on from here. And what do we have? We have the key speakers 2016. Anne Marie Slaughter, president and CEO of New America. She's Bilderberg, as I marked there with my stylus. She's also been on the Bilderberg Steering Committee. And some of these are not household names, but Henry Paulson, the former U.S. Treasury Secretary, kind of is. He was implicated somewhat in the financial shakedown and breakdown here in the U.S. in 2007, 2008. And there are others there, the mayors, including the Santiago, Chile mayor, a mayor from Germany, Kasim Reed of Atlanta, Georgia. He attended Bilderberg in 2014 in Denmark, and a mayor from Bangkok, Thailand. So that gives you some idea there. Moving forward. Now we have the 2017 Chicago Forum, and we have a video clip here. Ivo Dalder, the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, I believe we have a video clip, and he explains things in a rather revealing way, as I think we'll see.
Welcome to Chicago and to the 2017 Forum on Global Cities. I am Ivo Dalder, the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and it's great to have all of you here. It's difficult to imagine a more timely moment for us to convene this particular forum. In the year since we last met here in Chicago, indeed just in the last few days, we have seen examples of something that is quite extraordinary. Cities are increasingly becoming important as players on the national stage, bypassing, when necessary, national governments to look to each other for solutions to global problems. In the last week alone, mayors and city leaders across this country affirmed their support for what had originally been an agreement among nations, the Paris Climate Accord. Yet, climate change is not an outlier in city-to-city coordination. Quite the opposite. It's happening as well on issues of inclusion, immigration, health, security, governance, and human rights, and indeed so many other critical issues that face our world today. In fact, extraordinary is perhaps the wrong word to describe this trend. Direct city-to-city coordination is emerging and maturing and becoming wonderfully ordinary. Why? Why is this happening? The answer is that urbanization is the most consequential force shaping our political order in this century. It is undoubtedly the most dynamic force. More than 500 cities around the world now have a population of more than 1 million people. And yet that statistic alone does not quite capture the staggering pace at which cities are growing. In 1950, 1/3 of the world lived in urban areas. Today, well over half do. By 2050, it will be over 2/3, 6.3 billion people who will live and work in urban areas. At this very moment, a Chicago-sized city is being added to the world's population every 2 weeks. And that's why we need to engage the new people who are moving to cities and being born there, the next generation, about the power and promise and the challenges and capabilities that cities have is now even more important. And therefore, we're delighted today to have so many young professionals with us, including 32 students from global universities all around the world. Cities also hold great economic power, greater than ever. 80% of the world's economic output comes from cities. But so too do more than 70% of the greenhouse gases that are being emitted in the world. Politically and culturally, cities are the vanguards of openness, the champions of globalization. Important qualities in a time when nationalist and anti-globalist sentiments are re-emerging. Taken together, what these trends means is clear. A future dominated by cities is rapidly becoming our present.
And Keep going.
Different from previous years. The questions we hope to answer over the next few days are entirely new, and for good reason. Where previously we asked if cities drive the global economy, now we ask how they will continue to do so. Before we asked if cities could have a foreign policy. Now we're more interested in the examples of cities' diplomacy doing it at their best. Before we asked whether cities could challenge national governments for political power on the global stage, today we know they are. We want to know how they will continue to do so and to better the lives of the citizens of our cities.
Very interesting indeed. Moving on from there, before I get into the foreign policy of global cities at Chatham House that Evil Dalder brought to there in February 2018, I want to comment just a little bit on the videos we just watched. You'll notice that he talked about cities not only being dominant, but reaching out to each other irrespective of their home nation states and bypassing national governments whenever they deem it necessary. Now, in the United States, the way the system works is, let's say here in Texas, Austin is a creature of the state of Texas. It has absolutely no authority to engage in any kind of international machinations, diplomacy, policy making, heaven forbid. Zero authority to do such a thing. And the same could confidently be said about any of the 50 U.S. states. The cities within them are not federal cities, they're creatures of the states. They have city charters, but the city charters, not one I've ever seen, none of them give a city authority to step outside the boundaries of the U.S. in terms of policymaking, in terms of diplomacy. Indeed, the very idea of cities having diplomatic power raises far more questions than it answers, and it's rather bizarre if you think about it. And what Mr. Dalder said also at the end was that, just as of yesterday, foreign policy was a distant dream for cities. Now it's a reality, even routine, he's saying, among all those other things he listed. So that's a very revealing clip from Ivo Dalder there. Now, he did appear in early 2018, not long after that video clip. He went to Chatham House, and I remember writing about it, and already they're talking about the foreign policy of global cities, an area normally reserved to nation states, correct? So we move on from there. And this is Dr. Beza Yunal, I'll say it. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chatham House. My name is Beza Yunal. I'm a research fellow in the International Security Department here at Chatham House. That's who he is. And I underlined at this event, we're going to discuss the power and influence of cities while tackling global challenges. We'll look at the city's role in foreign policy making and discuss what any such foreign policy would look like in the future. Cities today are at the forefront of pressing challenges. They play a major role, for instance, in the climate change discussions. For that sake, I think the C40 confab, their blog sums it all up. Ending climate change starts in the cities. This, I think, is true for all issue areas. So what he means there is solving a lot of problems that they perceive to be problems starts in the cities. He thinks that's true for all issue areas. And I underlined another kind of amusing thing at the top there. The Chatham House registers as a charity, which is rather amusing in my book. The Bilderberg Group in New York State, the Friends of Bilderberg, the American Friends of Bilderberg, is also registered as a charity. They're the furthest thing from a charity that you can imagine, of course. Moving on from there, this is the council president, Evil Dalder, at Chatham House. This is some of what he had to say. So when I came to Chicago, it was an interest, including by the mayor, who was at the time a new mayor, a man named Rahm Emanuel, who was the chief of staff to President Obama, to think about how does this city, Chicago, think globally. And Chicago hosted a NATO summit that I covered back in 2012, I might add. And Dalder continued, and that led me to start thinking about places like London and Chicago, how cities can be actors on the global stage. And if you're an economist and you think about what's happening in the global economy, The growth of globalization has led to a diffusion of power not only among states, but away from states to other actors, corporate actors, terrorist networks, crime syndicates, and indeed cities have become actors on the global stage. They can affect change, and here's emphasis, they can work together with each other, either hopefully in concert with the nations of which they are a part, or at times at cross purposes. See, so there's an allegiance problem noted there once again. Very interesting. And moving forward from there, this is a little bit more of what Evo Dalder had to say at Chatham House early 2018. So a year ago, we published a report on Chicago's global strategy for how does Chicago engage the world and how does it benefit Chicago by engaging in the world. Again, not necessarily, he says, in opposition to states, but alongside or at least to express its own interest in states, cities' own interest in states. And the clear moment when it became evident that cities are actors for a city like Chicago came early June of 2017 when President Donald Trump, stood in the Rose Garden and announced that the United States that he was elected by the people of Pittsburgh, but not the people of Paris, as he put it, and that he was going to put the people of Pittsburgh first and withdraw from the Paris Agreement on climate change. And the reaction to this was, you may want to make that decision, but we're not going to go along. That's the global city's response to Donald Trump. And we are not going to go along. That meant corporate leaders in the United States. It meant state leaders, California's governor at the time, Jerry Brown, and city leaders, including those of Chicago. And they came together and said, we, the cities, are going to implement our pledge, and we are going to communicate to the United Nations that America will meet its obligations. Note the arrogance here. It's called America's Pledge, and each city and state and corporation set for itself a set of goals to start implementing it. So we, the city of Chicago, we hosted a meeting of the North American mayors at the end of December, that was 2017, where we agreed on a climate charter where each state set for itself a goal that it needs to meet in order for all of us together to meet the climate objectives. Now, if you sit back and kind of let that sink in, process what I just read, Donald Trump at that time, like him or not, the leader of America at the federal level, announced, and that's according to his authority, that he wanted to pull out of the Paris Climate Accord. And correctly, he's elected to serve the people of these United States. That includes Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And he is not elected by the American people in any way to serve France or the city of Paris. So Trump was speaking proper civics here, okay? But these mayors are saying, well, we're not going to stand for that. We're going to send our stuff directly to the UN and we're going to override you. So when Dalder says earlier in this statement here, he's not necessarily in opposition to nation states, he's very selective. And the dislike of Donald Trump was very palpable in the years that I covered the council in person and Trump was in office. You could see the disdain in much of what they did. But this is emblematic of just how cantankerous these city mayors are, these representing these global cities, and how they want to have their way come hell or high water to meet these sustainable development goals, irrespective of nation states if they have to. So that was a very, very important part of this presentation. This is a little bit more of what Dalder had to say at Chatham House. This was a very pivotal meeting. That's why I'm emphasizing it a lot. In this case, speaking about Donald Trump, in this case, we were against the state, against the United States, but in favor of an obligation that the United States had freely entered into not long before. So thinking through how cities can strategize internally and strategize cooperatively with other cities and other actors is extraordinarily important for figuring out how we're going to do it, how the world is going to be run in a different way. Think about those words, very revealing. And the challenge for city leaders, whether it's Sadiq Khan, he was mayor of London at one time. I don't know who's mayor of London now exactly, or Rahm Emanuel, who stepped down from Chicago around 2018, 2019, or Eric Garcetti, Los Angeles mayor, and others, here's the question, is how do we take the resources we have in the city, combine them, and do it in order for us to be more effective actors on the global stage? And I wrote the word subversion there. Is that the wrong word? Is that word too strong? I'll let you be the judge, but it definitely knocks on the door of it. Some even call it mutiny, at least a form of mutiny. Moving on, this is just a screenshot, the 2018 Chicago Forum on Global Cities. That came along not long after Eva Dalder got back from Chatham House, answering the question, yes, cities should have foreign policy, something reserved for nation states, and so on and so forth. We'll move on from that. That was just an illustrative thing. Now we have Mr. Robert Mugga, it's pronounced Mugga, and he's with the Agrapi Institute. He specializes in security, cities, climate action, and digital transformation. So that ties into the smart cities aspects of this. He co-founded this Agrapi Institute, if I'm saying that right, ranked the top social policy think tank in the world in 2019. And the SecDev Group, a data science company committed to detecting and deterring cyber threats and building digital resilience that fits into the context of smart cities. For decades, Mr. Mugga has advised national and municipal governments, tech companies and startups, and international organizations on issues ranging from crime prevention, predictive matters on crime, to digital transformation. Robert advises the World Economic Forum's Council on the Future of Cities, its annual Global Risk Report, and he advises another actor in this whole scheme, the Global Parliament of Mayors, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And Mr. Mugga was a speaker, a pretty prominent one, at the 2019 Pritzker Forum on Global Cities. And I believe we have a clip or two of him, also quite revealing. So let's go with Mr. Mugga's clip, at least the first one, or maybe both of them.
Any of you having trouble sleeping at night? I know I am. I think these folks may be part of the problem. You know, reactionary nationalists and populists, they've got a couple things in common. For one, they've got a stubborn immunity to science, especially science of climate change, on migration and security. They're also waging a full-scale assault on our cities, especially the underlying values of our cities, be it pluralism or cosmopolitanism or openness or tolerance. And maybe this isn't so surprising. After all, they're national politicians operating in the national interest. You know, if I'm honest, it's these nation states that really are contributing to my insomnia right now. We all tend to forget that we're in a 400-year-old experiment of political engineering. And despite what people say about the return of the nation state, I actually think they're approaching their expiry date. Look, they're not going to go away anytime soon, but the reality is that they're unable and unwilling to deal with some of the biggest challenges that we're facing right now. And part of the problem is that they're weakening. They're weakening from above because of hyper-globalization, the deregulation of capital, the flow of people and ideas, but they're also weakening from below because of the rise of social networks, of new technologies, of global philanthropy, of NGOs, of cities. And this couldn't happen at a worse time. You see, the world has changed, but the basic units of our international affairs have not. And I think we'd be better off looking at the world through the lens of cities. What you have here is over 2,000 cities with a population of 250,000 people or more. And to make it really simple, the bigger and redder the circle, the more fragile that city over the last 15 years, and the smaller and the bluer, the more resilient. If you look at this map, I want you to consider the following details. In 1648, when nation states first genuinely burst on the scene, less than 1% of the world lived in a city. Today, it's over half. By 2050, it'll be over 70%. That's 2.5 billion people moving to cities. That's baked in. That's not going to change. This is probably the most significant demographic shift in history. Tomorrow's hyper-urbanization isn't going to be evenly distributed. Most of it's going to be happening in this part of the world, in Africa and Asia. And this is going to generate enormous opportunities and challenges. On the opportunity side, we're going to see hundreds, if not thousands, of cities being built literally from scratch. They're going to be able to leapfrog old technologies, draw on distributed manufacturing, renewable energy, smarter mobility solutions, and the rest. And our big global cities, they're probably going to urbanize, they're going to densify, they're going to become more vertical and green. But the reality is the vast majority of the world's cities, thousands of them, are not going to be built with a future in mind. They're going to struggle to attract global capital, talent, and ideas. This is a really messy future that we're looking at. However,
And so there's Robert Muga's view of the world, a rather odd one, you might say. I would comment that you'll notice that before I get into Rahm Emanuel, you'll notice that Robert Muga makes the assumption that all cities have to be pluralistic. They have to have the same view on climate change. So therefore, their leaders all have to be cut from the same cloth. And these are the people that are the denizens of democracy and the arch enemies of autocracies. And it's just amazing how autocratic these Democrats are. Very autocratic and quite extreme in their own way. Meanwhile, they use projection and they call everybody else extremists, accusing everyone else of what they themselves are guilty of, but maybe are blind too. So one wonders what would happen if a Donald Trump, so to speak, metaphorically speaking, got elected mayor of Chicago or some other major city that's defined as a global city. How could that possibly join the network of global cities if they don't toe the line on absolutely every issue that these city leaders are calling out? But anyway, moving forward, what we're seeing here now is, as if it could be increased anymore, we're seeing the upping of the ante even more. And Rahm Emanuel in 2020, we heard Robert Muga in 2019, now we're in 2020. The COVID thing is just about to come along, the COVIDocracy. And Rahm Emanuel rolls out this book, get this title, The Nation City, Why Mayors Are Now Running the World. And just a year or two before this, as I mentioned, Evo Dahler said, we need to do all these things so we can run the world in a different way. I read that quote from his remarks at Chatham House just 2 years before this. How can we run the world a different way? So now we see it. This friend in Chicago of Evo Dahler, Rahm Emanuel, the nation city, why mayors are now running the world. And I wrote here, I'm going to consult some different notes here. Bear with me a second. I wrote here that just when it seemed that the global cities movement couldn't be more overtly radical, former Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel in late February addressed the nonprofit organization Chicago Ideas to pump his new book, the title of which takes the proverbial mask the rest of the way off the movement and lays bare its worldview, the nation city, why mayors are now running the world. Thus, the nation city has suddenly become a singular part of the collective global cities vernacular, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll move on from there because I believe we have one last video in my presentation.
This policy, and you interview a lot of mayors of a lot of cities here. You say that there is sort of this sort of co-opting of ideas among your colleagues. What great ideas from other mayors did you get that you brought here?
Well, I'll give you one example. The LED lights that we're doing throughout the city of Chicago. We were at a conference on climate change and some other things. The Mayor Gregor of Vancouver talked about smart poles and LED lights and other services you can do on those poles. We're now in the middle of a conversion of all our streetlights. LED came from Mayor Gregor out of Vancouver, is an example. There's Mayor Helgaldo out of Paris and I held a conference here on cities and waterfronts. We had the mayor of Cape Town, Haifa, Milan, Paris, Mexico City, Buenos Aires, Chicago, Dallas, and we all learned from each other some of the ideas of what to do on our waterfronts and riverfronts that became access. But the one that comes immediately to mind is obviously the LED lights that we're doing here in the city of Chicago, as an example of an idea that another mayor had.
And another mayor that you sat down with before you were inaugurated was Michael Bloomberg from New York. You asked him his advice. What things should you focus on that was kind of unorthodox? What did he say?
It was interesting because I said, look, I've talked about education, economic development, corporate recruitment. I said, give me one thing I haven't talked about that I should know about. He said, tourism. I said, so I went back, looked at it. Chicago's tourism was non-existent. We were very good on business travelers, not tourism. We reorganized the entire policy strategy. You ended up with the, obviously, the James.
And that's an adequate cross-section of that. And as I noted here, this is an article I wrote about Rahm Emanuel's book. For this exclusive report, this writer has found that there's been a gradual turning up of the heat on this issue that appears to be deliberate. 3 or 4 years ago, a forum that this writer covered, the annual Pritzker Forum on Global Cities, there were several suggestive statements about localities doing an eventual end run around the nation state, but most of the statements were confined to mayors simply wanting a seat at the table, et cetera, et cetera. They wanted to simply be consulted about immigration policy, international trade, foreign policy, diplomacy. The next step, as I noted, came in February 2018 when Evil Dalder, president of the Chicago Council, traveled to London's illustrious Chatham House, and that's the same money line as the CFR. The program that Dalder attended explored the revealing question, should cities have their own foreign policy? They answered in the affirmative on that. And then that very same month, in Rahm Emanuel, who served 2 terms. Oh, that's right. That very same month in 2018, February, then Mayor Rahm Emanuel of Chicago, who served 2 terms before his 2019 retirement. At that time, he helped unveil the Resilient Chicago Plan, an offshoot of the North American Climate Summit in Chicago held in December of 2017, which I mentioned earlier. That summit, the first of its kind, held by the Global Covenant of Mayors, led by Michael Bloomberg, Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. That's an EU-created entity that presided over the former New York mayor and former presidential candidate Michael Bloomberg. He leads that. It provided the Chicago Climate Charter. That's what came out of this. That pact comports with the ongoing Global Cities movement. Moving on from there, and this is a really important thing to keep in mind. What's fundamental here, this is more of my article about Rahm Emanuel. What's fundamental here is that the participating mayors appear to pay no heed to the U.S. Constitution's Article 1, Section 10, to wit, no state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, and no state shall, without the consent of Congress, enter into any agreement or compact with another U.S. state or with a foreign power. At the Chicago Idea interview on C-SPAN 2, where Rahm Emanuel shared several personal stories with a moderator, and that was a different presentation that Rahm Emanuel gave, different than the one we just saw. Emanuel was silent on this other presentation on the fact that municipalities are creatures of their respective states and therefore would automatically collide with Article 1, Section 10 under any city foreign policy scheme or city foreign diplomacy scheme. In other words, at least in the United States, since the cities are creatures of the states and the states cannot enter into any of these foreign compacts without the permission of Congress, neither can the subdivisions of the states enter into these foreign agreements. And these city leaders, these global city leaders, are absolutely silent on that constitutional provision. And so we're going from there. Here we go. Now, understanding the global ecosystem of city networks, this is from the SAGE journals. We're taking a little bit of a turn here. And we'll keep moving forward. Here it says, cities are formulating collaborations across borders at an unprecedented rate in the ways that I've described. city networks now form a wide ecosystem of global partnerships between local authorities that is often underestimated. It might be time to think of city networks more explicitly as institutionalized and preserving a challenging form of more than local urban governance, and so on and so forth. So that's a further illustration of where they're going with this. Where cities network together, they're basically indifferent to the nations that they inhabit. And once they network together, they're all sharing the same sustainable development goals. They want to meet those goals. That's their objective. They share all these the common ideology, the common political view, the common goals, as I mentioned. They're all in league with one another. They don't really need the nation state they're inhabiting from their point of view. And once they network together, it devolves power to them from the world devolving to them. So, well, in a sense, it's mostly a bottom-up thing. So basically, once this network is formed, the global governance is a matter of reality in terms of day-to-day living, day-to-day governing, because they feel so many people are going to be living in cities. So it's a very underhanded scheme, and it has many parts. It's very multifaceted, but that's sufficient with that particular item there from Sage Journals. It's just more emphasis of what I've been talking about. Now, moving into 2021, the Pritzker Forum on Global Cities, there's Gillian Tett of Financial Times. They're doing their same collaboration rather than reporting on it. And there's Marvin Rees, the mayor of Bristol, UK, and Pursuing Equity. I wrote about this one, and they were lamenting, for one thing, that minorities supposedly were not getting the supplies of the COVID jabs that they ought to get. The people of color, the minorities, because of their status, precisely because of their status, they deserve, these city leaders said, to have the vaccines, the jabs right at their disposal, even if they have to take RVs and vans into the different poorer communities in greater Chicago, for instance, and take the shots right to the people. You'll notice that they make the automatic assumption that everyone among the minorities wants these jabs. So there's kind of a hidden bias against the minorities in a sense. There's a covert racism there, you might say. They simply assume that the Black communities, Hispanic communities, and other minorities, precisely because they're minorities, they're supposedly downtrodden, and they're just aching to get these shots, rather than thinking that maybe they're individuals too, and they can think as individuals, not just as a group. And maybe some of them have questions about these jabs, but there was no comprehension of that point of view. And Dr. Anthony Fauci spoke at this 2021 virtual forum. Again, the forum went virtual 2020 and 2021 due to COVID. But that's some of what they talked about. They also talked about they had to do away with what many of us have heard of, and that's called vaccine nationalism. Vaccine nationalism being that a country like America shouldn't be selfish with the Pfizer and Moderna potions, the jabs that it manufactures. It should make more than enough at U.S. taxpayer expense, and then use that largesse, that extra money out of our treasury, and send the jabs to other poorer countries. You'll notice the parallel. Just as they wanted to share the jabs with more and more minorities within the United States, they wanted to do the same thing outside the U.S. in the nation, in the world at large. So there's this assumption, once again, that everybody just can't wait to get this jab, and there couldn't possibly be any significant adverse effects going on. And that was the core of what was discussed at this Pursuing Equity Forum in 2021, the Global Cities Forum. And we'll move on from there. This is just a quick illustrative thing. We got into 2022 for the Forum on Global Cities, and there's Ed Luce of Financial Times, and he's with a Ukraine source. I didn't get the name, but I kept this slide because if I kept it on the dimmer setting, then you could actually read what it was about. There it says in the upper left-hand corner, the Pritzker Forum on Global Cities, Ukraine and cities on the front lines. So the topic switched to how do cities deal with direct experience in warfare. Not a lot of profound things were covered, but it just got into how would cities marshal resources, the ones being attacked, how would they get resources from other cities, how would they coordinate that? And that would include medical, it would include armaments, and on down the line. But that's what went down at the Forum on Global Cities, generally speaking, in 2022. So we're getting closer. Okay. We're getting closer to the present time. This is just another illustrative slide, but the title of it is very revealing. Better City Network Data empowers climate action from below. So there's that bottom up thing again, this time getting into network data that knocks on the door of the smart cities grid, of course. And this is an important little side issue, but it's very important in my mind. It shows the duplicity of these think tanks. This is what I call the Great McCormick Contradiction, a legacy of service. This is Robert R. McCormick, the former longtime publisher of the Chicago Tribune when the Tribune was an actual newspaper. McCormick was the longtime editor and publisher of the Tribune, I'm reading here, and his media empire included New York Daily News, Washington Times, Herald, TV and radio, etc. He even had 7,000 square miles of Canadian timberland with which to get paper to print his newspaper. He died in 1955. He was known as the Colonel for short, and he left behind a great philanthropic foundation. And note what it says here that reflects his core values. Oh, really? So what do we find? In 2018, a $4 million grant from the Robert R. McCormick Foundation, as I noted here, totally at odds with what the Colonel McCormick's worldview was. Colonel McCormick was not unlike Donald Trump. That might be a slightly crude comparison, but he was a America first, nationalist, anti-interventionist, anti-war, anti-income tax leader of the Chicago Tribune and those other media back when there was actually variety in U.S. newspapers. And I noted here, his support of limited government clashed with FDR's New Deal government activism. McCormick also opposed President Roosevelt indirectly by supporting the America First Committee that was led by Charles Lindbergh. McCormick's battlefield experience during World War I caused him to oppose the commitment of American lives and treasure in foreign wars. Keeping that all in mind, listen to what Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council, had to say upon receiving this grant from the Robert R. McCormick Foundation, completely contradicting their namesake. Here's what Daalder said. I'm reading it. This generous grant demonstrates the foundation's confidence in the council to advance innovative ideas and arm civic leaders and experts in shaping a new world order. Cities are on the front lines of national and global challenges, from immigration to inequity to climate change, and this grant will support the council's efforts to convene civic, business, academic, cultural things, etc., and solutions to these and other issues that transcend borders. I don't know what Mr. Daalder is smoking, but there is nothing in McCormick's legacy that would support any of that. So this gives you kind of a look at the character of these organizations that are involved in global cities. And we're kind of combing through some of the rest of this. And there it is. There's where the money went. The Robert R. McCormick Foundation Hall. And there's Daalder addressing a group of what they call young global leaders, training the globalists for tomorrow, not unlike the World Economic Forum and its training of would-be leaders. So a very duplicitous and completely non-representational use of the McCormick Foundation's funds, according to how their actual namesake was and according to what his philosophy was as that publisher. But we'll go on from there. This is what's coming up. So this thing is still alive and well. The annual summit 2023 in September in Monrovia, Liberia. The GPM, the Global Parliament of Mayors, will be getting together. And this is something I found late in the game putting together this presentation. I want to cover this momentarily. Who knew, at least I didn't, and I hadn't heard it mentioned much, if at all, among my colleagues. Who knew that there's now a U7? You thought the G7 was enough, the group of 7 nations. Now there's the U7. The Urban 7 is what that stands for. And there's a secretariat. And they're getting involved directly where members, leaders of different cities, and private associations that are in league with those cities are actually meeting at the same time, in person mainly, with the G7 at the G7 summit. So now, through the Urban 7 and the G7, there's direct collaboration and direct meetings to hardwire cities into the foreign policy grid, you might say. And that covers lots of issues, not just foreign policy, but health. Climate change is the main driving issue right now. But this is a relatively new development. I'm understanding that it was sired or birthed in 2021, evidently with very little fanfare. And as of 2022 and now, they're really turning up the heat. So now there's something much more to discuss in future reports of on UK Column that I'll be giving. And I also have an article just about written on the Urban 7. So that's a new kid on the block, a relatively new kid on the block in the overall global cities movement. And this is a Global Parliament of Mayors resolution. There's Marvin Rees of Bristol again. Marvin Rees of Bristol has led the resolution as rapporteur, together with Robert Mugga. There he is again, chairman of the Global Parliament of Mayors Advisory Committee, to speed up the achievement of Sustainable Development Goal number 16 and promote inclusive economic development and so on and so forth. These commitments are informed by science and good practice, they claim, and have been developed by experts from around the world, said the I believe that's what Mr. Rees had to say. The print's a little small there from my perspective. But that's a little bit more of what's going on with the Global Parliament of Mayors. They want to reduce violence. And of the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, they take them number by number. I believe there are something like 20 of those without looking it up. There may be more, but each Sustainable Development Goal is looked at specifically, and they're trying to get all the cities on track to achieve those goals. So again, they'll have to have all the same ideology and no diversity in their leadership, being the very autocrats that these global cities leaders say they decry. And there are different things. The United Nations has a system-wide guidelines on safer cities and human settlements. So the UN, of course, is involved because they're the main arbiter or the main parent of the Sustainable Development Goals. That's tied directly to the UN. We also have the new urban agenda, not just the U7 or Urban 7. We have the new urban agenda, and that gets into the person that wrote this report said, I'm pleased to present the United Nations system-wide guidelines on safer cities and human settlements adopted by the UN Habitat Assembly in May of 2019. That's what that's about. And this is supposed to be based on 25 years of work on a safer cities program to improve urban safety. And that necessarily involves the smart cities grid, of course. And as it notes in this report, I blew this up here, as the 2030 agenda shows, what used to be Agenda 2021, now it's Agenda 2030, safety and security are key elements of the quality of life in urban centers from the perspective of sustainable social, cultural, economic development, civic vitality, and human rights. Without safety, there is no sustainable urban development. And without sustainable urban development, there is no safety. Of course, the word safety can be a little bit malleable. And it notes here from the same urban agenda report, while elected municipal officials must exert political leadership in partnership with other levels of government, to take on the task of preventing urban crime and violence, national governments must go beyond our traditional criminal justice system, police, courts, and corrections, if we are to prevent crime in our cities and in our human settlements. The national government must be a partner in financing local comprehensive crime prevention and urban safety efforts. And there have been dystopian movies that have shown predictive programming. I think one was called Minority Report, if memory serves. Preventing crime is not a bad idea in general, of course, but just what would that involve in terms of smart city surveillance? Just how much surveillance would it require? What measures would be involved? These are the questions that naturally come up. And this UN Safer Cities and Human Settlements report notes this: partnerships in the development and implementation of tools, strategies, and approaches will drive the achievement of urban safety and security for all. In this process, local governments, in collaboration with subnational and national governments and all relevant stakeholders worldwide, that's the big village here, will contribute to the realization of a roadmap for urban safety and security worldwide, and thereby contribute to the realization of the 2030 agenda and the new urban agenda. And that's what that's about. And this is from the new urban agenda. I'll read the bottom part. The implementation of the new urban agenda contributes to the implementation and localization. Get that? The implementation and localization of the 2030 agenda for sustainable development goals in an integrated manner, and to the achievement of the sustainable development goals and targets, including goal 11 of making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. All the favorite buzzwords of what I call globalese. But that's quite revealing. Localization of this agenda. Sometimes they call that globalism. And this is a quick slide from a website, Jumpstart, how smart cities can pave the way for this safer society that the UN's talking about. And it says here, you show red rectangles around some people. It says alert, alert, alert. And the black rectangles around other people, evidently they're safe and no threat. So that's a little bit of a glimpse into, into what they're talking about. How they would know that someone would be an alert and someone else would not be worth the alert label, I don't know. They don't really explain. Smart city technologies can reduce crime by 30 to 40%, they claim, by leveraging real-time monitoring systems to automatically send alerts to law enforcement. And in the US, we have these fusion centers where local, state, and federal police all collaborate, not always in real well-marked buildings, and they gather all this data. So that just about winds it up. There's other things I could get into. Closed circuit TV for real-time monitoring, of course, would be part of this. And that shows people being surveilled. Facial recognition technology, of course, being part of this scheme. That's why I put the exclamation parts on that, exclamation points. And securing the global cities, that's an initiative that's the Global Cities Initiative. That's JP Morgan Chase and Brookings. So we have bankers involved with the Bilderberg Connected Brookings Institution, securing global cities, much along the lines that I just discussed. Part of it involved this now late military general shown here, Raymond Odierno. He passed away recently, so there's military generals involved in these things. And exploiting new technologies. This is a part of this Global Cities Initiative report. You'll notice it shows soldiers on the streets as a routine thing in Paris near the Eiffel Tower. And exploiting technologies, it talks about that. Communication software such as Telegram and WhatsApp, as well as easy access by criminals and extremists to inexpensive and expendable phones. All that makes it harder to track people and listen to their conversations. You'll notice that it says criminals and extremists. as if there's really no major difference between a criminal, which is a fairly clear-cut thing, and an extremist, which is a more ambiguous thing. What is an extremist and who are the real extremists, right? These are the questions that they don't really want to answer. And this just shows some major metro areas. We kind of saw that in Robert Muga's presentation. But global urbanization, it shows these same trends. By 2050, they figure about 2/3 of the people in the world, give or take, will be living in cities or urban areas. Some people beg to differ. And this is the last slide, I believe. At a recent Texas convention, John Bush of the Live Free Academy spoke of localized agriculture, rural housing communities, and other living trends that could defeat the so-called inevitable megatrend of people flocking to these global megacities. And as I report, and as I conclude here, as I reported on UK Column fairly recently, they're even looking at the megalopolis, where huge cities actually grow together and become these ultra massive urban centers. And evidently that would be part of this rather grim looking future. So with that, I believe that's all I have in my preparation.
Mark, thank you very much. Really fascinating analysis, overview of really policy and the organizations that are forming the global cities and the smart cities. And I'm really glad you've done this, because for me, this is one of the most powerful things for all of us to be able to understand how these things come into being. The idea of smart cities, the idea of these powerful global cities, doesn't appear out of nowhere. Men and women in rooms have sat down and planned these, and you've really been taking the lid off it. But maybe one of the most powerful things for me, as I'm listening to you describe this, is the similarity with the organization Common Purpose. Now, this was a charity which I looked at many, many years ago, because it was taking individuals from different sectors of society. It might have somebody from the NHS, somebody from local government. It was bringing them all together. And then, to quote the then chief executive, it was getting them to act beyond authority. And as I said many times, if you're a police officer and you start acting beyond authority, what does that make you, as one example? But what I picked up from your talk as you went through, Mark, was that essentially this appears to be common purpose doctrine unleashed on the leaders of cities. So you bring the mayors together and you invite the mayors of cities to act outside authority. And you gave an example that we ended up with cities in America challenging the official government line, and you quite rightly labelled it as subversion. But I'll just echo that back to you, that for me, you're describing the common purpose system now being unleashed internationally through this globalist system. I don't know whether you'd like to comment on that.
Oh, absolutely. Let's say that I agreed with all these global cities machinations, that I agreed with the Sustainable Development Goals, and that I wanted to reach those goals, and that I'm a mayor of a city, a global city. There's only one thing wrong. I don't have the authority under my city charter, which is my only guiding document, along with the U.S. and state constitutions. I have zero authority under all those documents to go beyond my function as mayor in a municipal sense and go overseas and form associations and quasi-governmental organizations and actually engage in policy making or massaging with other mayors. I don't have the authority, whether I want to achieve those goals or not. Now, I could write to my congressman or write to my State Department and say, hey, maybe keep this in mind. But to actually form the Urban 7, the U7, and then meet with the G7, they just don't have the authority. And they're engaging in what you could probably accurately call a form of mutiny. And I'm not saying all nation states have their acts together. They don't. What's the nation state? Almost 500 years old. I understand that there's dysfunctional states, that there's what they call failed states. But on the other hand, the people that elect these leaders elect national leaders to do national stuff, state leaders to do state stuff, and local and municipal leaders to pick up the trash, make sure the street lights work, fight crime without abridging people's rights. And everybody has their place. And the common purpose approach is outside of that. And that's very damaging because then nobody knows. It creates confusion as to how things are even supposed to work.
It creates confusion, but of course the loyalty issue is also broken because instead of an individual being loyal to their country, or perhaps we could even say to their city, that city, it isn't the people of the city who are going to be in dialogue with cities overseas, of course. It's going to be a very tightly controlled group of individuals. This is what the mayor system is about, is creating a city fiefdom where there will be the mayor and just a couple of people who are going to have the dialogue with other city-states. We bring all those global cities together, and then it will be just the people present in the meeting, maybe only 50 people, who decide what the policy is. So it's subversion. To me, this is very clear that it's subversion. But for me, I'm biased because of the work that we did many years ago on common purpose in this country. It's so easy to see the similarities with common purpose then, now common purpose coming through global cities. And the other bit which I felt is the moment you started to talk about security, which you did in the latter part of your talk that you've just given. So what are we talking about? Safety, preventing crime. We're not talking about dealing with the homeless. We're not talking about dealing with people who are on the poverty line. We've got that same mantra. You've got to support what we're building here because it will keep you safe. The opposite's true, isn't it?
Well, very likely. They do talk a little bit about economic matters and economic measures that they think could help those on the lower rungs of the economic ladder and maybe prevent crime that is born of poverty. There's a little bit of talk about that. Of course, these are the same poor people living in urban areas that they automatically assume all want the COVID jab. No problem there. So you wonder, just how much do they really care about the downtrodden? But yeah, safer can mean so many things, and it means different things to different people. And when you talk about preventing crime, and if you're going to get serious about it, then you have to start looking at people who are suspects, and then you have to wonder about the criteria of how to decide someone is worth an alert or worth an extra look or worth being surveilled. How do they decide that? Based on what evidence? Based on what information? Would there be any evidence at all? And when you look at the ideology of these mayors and the private associations they work with, it's all of one cloth. So, and you'll notice that they talk about criminals and extremists in the same breath. So that's very suggestive. Granted, I'm being a little speculative, but it's very suggestive that people that they don't people that they don't agree with politically, that question elections, they're election deniers or some other kind of denier, etc., that these political opponents, the potential would be very high that they'd end up on the surveillance list because of the way they commingle concepts like extremists and criminals. So, yeah, it's the potential for abuse is very evident.
Right, and Mark, you're seeing this very clearly, and you're seeing it from evidence, from documents, from statements, from video clips. We've just come on to this business that you've got people openly stating that if necessary, they will go against their nation state. Why is it that senators, for example, in the US can't see the danger of what's being built here? If you've been elected as a representative of the American people via whatever state you come into your seat of power in government, why is it that we have elected representatives who can't see the danger of this system?
One reason is extreme lack of publicity. I'm not boasting in the least when I say that I'm among the relative few, there are others, that have even reported on global cities and what they are, what they mean, where they're headed. The media, as I mentioned with Financial Times being an example, simply collaborates. They don't report this stuff. A lot of people don't even know this stuff exists, and that includes congressmen. It's pretty amazing. And as I mentioned, there's some 90 think tanks like the Chicago Council, some bigger, some smaller, some less active, some more active, honeycombing the U.S. under the umbrella of the World Affairs Council of America. How do you miss that 3,000-ton gorilla, right? How do you not see that? How do you not know about it? Well, the collaborative media blackout is part of it. When I covered Anders Fogh Rasmussen's, the former head of NATO, speaking to the Chicago Council in 2016, I just went there with my notebook and, took a few pictures. I was the only reporter there. When the Chicago Tribune gets involved at all with the council, it's to collaborate. If the Chicago Sun-Times gets involved, it's to collaborate. They don't report. They take part.
Yeah.
And that's one of the chief reasons, but not the only one, why more state and federal legislators don't know about this and therefore don't complain about it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that. Now, before I let you go, would you like to say how viewers and listeners to today's event can get in touch with you or see more of your material?
Well, of course, every Monday on UK Column, we're still doing the column tomorrow, right?
We certainly are.
Yeah, I'm going to have more on the Urban 7 tomorrow, so tune in for that. I have a blog, thetruthhound.com. I do a weekly radio show, republicbroadcasting.org, called Stop the Presses. That's 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time, U.S., every Wednesday. And I still write some for American Free Press, as you mentioned. I've contributed here and there to some local publications in Michigan and whatnot, but that's really of no interest to UK Column viewers. But anyway, that's the main outlets. And it's great to be working for the column, of course. And again, more tomorrow on the Urban 7. That's a really kind of new kink or new link in the chain here. So,
okay, Mark, excellent. Thank you very much for that. Very enjoyable, very informative. And I think you've given audience a lot to think about and a lot of places to go and research for themselves. Now, that brings us up to the next break. We are going to be breaking now till 3:20 when we'll have our next speaker, David Dubine. Now, David has modified his talk a little bit. I'm going to need my glasses for this to make sure I give you the accurate title. But I understand he is now giving us Surviving the Containment Barrier, Atmospheric Phenomena, Monetary Changes, and Supply Chain Breakdowns. And I'm sure this will be extremely interesting. And we look forward to seeing you back online, back with us at 3:20. Thank you.